Tonight, Dr. Plague reads Lechuza. Enjoy. I need to tell someone about this, mostly to get it off my chest, but also because, as screwed up as the situation is, it's one of the best stories I've ever heard. I attend a large university in Arizona. I won't say which, but my friends and I were sharing a bottle of Jack the other night, and we started sharing stories. Somehow, we got on the subject of spooky stories, and it appeared that several of us had a strange occurrence to talk about. Gabriel told us about a weird apartment that he and his mother had lived in when they were in West Virginia. Apparently his mother had woken up screaming one night after a dark figure had appeared over her bed. He had come in and found it melting away into nothing, and the two of them had moved out shortly thereafter. John told us about a weird deer he'd seen on a hunting trip, and I told them about a sound I'd heard outside my parents' house in Montana throughout my childhood. One of Dad's friends, he was a zoologist or something, said it didn't sound like any animal he was familiar with. Dad jokingly asked him if it was a Bigfoot or something. He never really quite denied it. He got spooky quiet and just said he wouldn't be caught out dead in the woods, especially not after dark. We never went camping out there anymore, but we certainly never went past the property line either after dark. Passed the bottle to Samuel, and for once, he actually took a sip. Samuel, or Sam for short, had been living in the dorm since before we'd arrived at university. He was in his third year and was studying engineering as he worked towards a bachelor's degree. He had told us several stories about growing up in a small town in Mexico, and how his uncle was thanks to his current status as a student. His uncle was a professor of Spanish studies and antiquities, and he had offered to help his nephew get a student visa so he could do more than drink shitty beer in the local bar and do manual labor his whole life. I opened up saying that it was weird to see Samuel drink, but I don't think you understand how strange it was. Samuel was our permanent designated driver because in the 2 years that we'd known him, I had never so much as seen him touch a bottle of alcohol, unless it was to throw it away or take it from us when we had enough. He took a moment to collect his thoughts before saying in a hollow voice, "I told you all I grew up in Mexico, right?" We all nodded. He continued, "Well, I grew up in this rural little town right outside of Hermosillo. It wasn't large, maybe 8,000 people in the whole town, and most of our work came from the processing plant or from the farms that operated around the small town. My mother and I lived there with my abuelo and my abuela. My uncle was living in America and sending money back when he could. My abuelo was a horse breeder, something my family had practiced for generations, and he would work for the stockman for one of the larger ranches in the area. We weren't quite as well off as the rancher, but we were doing okay. Wasn't a bad life. It was hard, but not without its pleasures. When I was in high school, my friends and I would go to parties held at the local farms. The rancher's son, Santiago, and I had been friends since we were young, and we palled around with some of the ranch hand sons, Juan, Christopher, and Mateo. We were good friends, probably the best friends I've ever had, but one night we found something that none of us quite believed in. We had all grown up with stories about La Llorona or El Cibon, but my mother always loved to use a certain legend to scare me. La Lechuza was a witch who turned herself into some sort of owl demon after her death. She was said to roam the lands, hunting for drunks or just children out after dark. She would make noises in the night to trick you into opening your window so she could steal your eyes. She would pretend to be a baby to lure you into the woods. She would create thunderstorms and other nasty things and would come to get naughty children if they acted out. La Lechuza was used a lot in my house to get me to do things like chores or homework that I really didn't want to do. By the time I was a teenager, though, I was kind of done with my mom's scary stories about owl ladies. I was much more interested in drinking with my friends and meeting girls. I was 16 when she caught me on my way out the door. "I know where you're going off to. I beg you, do not go out there and drink with your friends." I brushed her off, saying I was of age, and if I wanted to go hang out with my friends, then I would. And if La Lechuza would happen across you in your group? I scoffed, telling her that her stories didn't scare me anymore. "That story is what killed your father," she started to say, but I cut her off. Dad had died in a drunk driving accident before I was born. He had driven off the road and hit a tree, his car erupting into a ball of flame, and that's why we had nothing to bury. But Mom had insisted that it had been La Lechuza who had driven him off the road. This had made me even scarier of the creature when I was a kid, but now it made me mad that she would use my father's death like this. I left without another word, climbing into Santiago's car as it pulled away from my house for the last time. She was standing in the road crying as we drove off. That image will be scarred into my brain until the day I die. We were out late. I couldn't tell you much about the party, just that it was in someone's barn. The beer was hot, the women were lukewarm, and the music was subpar at best. I drank too much, trying to get the fight with my mom out of my head, and by the time we called it a night, I was well and truly drunk. We climbed into Santiago's car, all of us laughing and tipsy. We started out, Santiago managing to keep it on the road as we whooped and hollered in the back seat. He was laughing along with us, turning the music up on the radio, but when he swerved suddenly, we all screamed like banshees. He hauled us back on the road, Mateo opening the window to vomit, and I leaned up as I asked him what was wrong. He looked pale, all the tipsy scared out of him as he stammered, I thought there was an old lady in the road, but when she turned, her body looked wrong. I said how weird it was to see someone so old out this late, but suddenly I yelled for him to look. Something was in the road, and if it was what he had seen before, he had been absolutely right. It was hunched over, a long cloak on its shoulders, and it looked deformed. It turned to look at the car as it barreled forward, and I could see piercing red eyes that bore into my soul. I saw it all in the space of 5 seconds, maybe, but those eyes will stay with me forever. Santiago never had a chance to do anything. He just plowed right into her, doing 55. The car suddenly stopped dead, and I came to about a minute later. I had boffed my head pretty good on the seat, but one look at Santiago told me I had gotten off lucky. He had slammed into the windshield, breaking his neck and turning his skull into a rotten gourd. The others seemed to be okay, but the car was smoking, and we climbed out as we assessed the damage. The whole front end was smashed in like we'd hit a tree or a big rock, but nothing was in the road to be hit. I remembered the old lady and moved off to check the ditches, thinking maybe we had knocked her off the road. The others just milled about, not sure what to do, and that's when it happened. The moon was full that night, or I may very well have missed it. A shadow passed over me, a thing with a wingspan like a condor, and I looked up just in time to see it drop onto my friends as they stood huddled around the car. It had landed on Juan, breaking his back and riding him to the ground. He screamed, his scream watery and miserable. He wouldn't scream for long, though. The bird dropped its head and began to feed on him, its beak plunging and diving as the other two backed away in horror. When it looked up, face dripping blood and owl eyes glaring at me, I ran. I don't know if the other two ran at the time, but I felt like a mouse who'd seen an owl. I ran, still drunk and weaving, and the houses swam up in my peripherals. I could still hear that wet, crunching sound as the creature fed, and I stumbled as my feet hit a root. I kept running, kept moving, kept showing my heels as the houses wobbled like an oil painting all around me. I just kept running, knowing that my house couldn't be far, not noticing the lack of night sounds until it was too late. When that unearthly screech split the night, I panicked and turned a corner at random. When my foot hit a pothole, I thought for sure I was going to die. My world suddenly exploded with light, and I stumbled back on my hands and butt as a bright something nearly blinded me. I turned, putting my back to those blinding lights, and saw a horror as it descended. The headlights spotlighted the owl thing, and as it swooped down on me, I figured this was the end. I closed my eyes and put my hands up across my face, preparing for the end. That's when I heard my mom yelling at the thing. She came out of the car, shouting curses and brandishing a cross on a long silver chain. The owl monster flapped its wings, changing its course and taking off again. It screeched loudly, flapping those wings angrily as it flew away. My mother helped me into the car then, but I must have passed out, because I woke up in my bed the next morning. I would have believed it was a dream if Mom hadn't told me all about it as we sat at the breakfast table. She had made food, and there was a pot of coffee there as well. As I ate, she told me all of it. How the creature had killed my dad one night as he drove home drunk, how Santiago and Juan had been found dead that morning, how my other friends had never arrived home that night, She spelled it out for me and told me how lucky I was to be alive. She said I had been given a chance and that it was up to me to figure out how to use it. She wasn't happy with my answer after I'd thought about it for a few days, but I think she understood. I still went to those parties, but I never drank again. Instead, I helped people get home safely. I never saw that creature again, but there were nights that I imagined I could feel its hateful stare. I was taking its prey from it, stealing its food, and it never quite forgave me for that. Not a day goes by that I don't think about that night and my friends who died. We sat there, drinking as we listened to his story, a cold chill flowing through us as we took it all in. I'd say this was the end, but that wouldn't do him or his story justice. 3 weeks ago, Samuel came to me in tears and told me that his mother was going to die. I sat him down. He was shaking like a leaf, and asked him how he could possibly know that. Before that, I hadn't seen him in class in a few days, and he looked tired and rattled. I dreamed I was in my mother's house, the one she has on my grandparents' property, and I heard her crying. I walked into the living room, and she was sitting at the kitchen table. I walked up behind her, putting a hand on her shoulder, and asked her what was wrong. She grabbed my arm, and her hand had become a claw. Her head turned around, and she screeched at me through that owl beak. Her face had become that of the Owl Witch, and just before I woke up, she screamed my mother's name. I asked him what that meant, and he said, "Some people say that seeing her in a dream means that someone you love will die. She screamed my mother's name. I can't ignore that." 3 days later, he told me he was returning home for his mother's funeral. They found her in her room. She'd had a heart attack. I need to go home and say goodbye. Will you watch my plants while I'm away? I told him I would, but I think he knew he wasn't coming back. A week ago, I asked his uncle if there was any news. His uncle only sighed and told me that his nephew was missing. My mother tells me that he went to the house he and his mother had shared. No one has seen him since. We don't know where he is, but if you're still watering his plants, I'll pick them up this afternoon. Hopefully, I can give them to him when he comes back. I don't know what became of Sam, but I pray that the Owl Witch, Lechuza, did not get him. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. It's time once again to thank our Patreon supporters. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle, who is a member of our Spooky Skeleton tier. Thanks, Leslie. We couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to hear your name read at the end of every video, come to Patreon and pledge $5 a month to join our Spooky Skeleton tier. If you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can always follow the link below to Amazon and buy a book, or just come back next week and hear more stories. We always appreciate you stopping by. Until then, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.